On January 21, 2025, a remarkable decision came down from the Supreme Court of the United States. The justices had ruled on a case that could change everything for one woman sitting alone on Oklahoma's death row. Her name is Brenda Andrew. She is now 61 years old and has spent over 2 decades awaiting execution. But Brenda is not just another death row inmate. She is the only woman in Oklahoma currently facing the death penalty. In a state that has executed 199 men since 1915, only 3 women have ever been put to death. So what makes Brenda Andrews' case so extraordinary? It's not simply a question of whether she killed her husband back in 2001. It's about the methods prosecutors used to convince a jury to sentence her to death. The Supreme Court reviewed every aspect of her trial and concluded that something might have gone terribly wrong. In a 7-2 decision, they instructed lower courts to examine the case once more. The question they raised is simple, yet powerful. Was Brenda Andrews' trial so unfair that it violated her constitutional rights? This case is no longer just about one woman. It shines a spotlight on how the justice system treats women compared to men. It challenges whether prosecutors can exploit gender stereotypes and sexual characterizations to secure a death sentence. Before we delve into this story, take a moment to like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing you real, meaningful true crime stories. Stay with us. This is Court of Secrets. What really happened on that November night in 2001? And did Brenda Andrews' sexuality send her to death row instead of the facts of the case? Brenda Andrew didn't begin her life as a criminal. She grew up in Enid, Oklahoma, in a deeply religious Christian family. She was a diligent student, attending school and church regularly, and seemed poised for a bright and promising future. Her parents instilled strong moral values in her, encouraging her to do what was right and uphold a sense of honor and responsibility. Brenda carried these lessons with her into adulthood, excelling in school and forming relationships that reflected her upbringing. She seemed like the picture of normalcy, a young woman with aspirations and potential, a life that others would envy. When Brenda married Rob Andrew, a successful advertising executive, everything appeared perfect to outsiders. They moved to Oklahoma City, built a comfortable home, and had 2 children. Brenda took on the role of a devoted wife and mother. She became active in their local church, volunteering as a Sunday school teacher. Each week she taught children about faith, morality, and the importance of making good choices. To neighbors, friends, and fellow congregants, Brenda and Rob seemed like the ideal family, a model Christian household. Yet beneath this veneer of perfection, tensions and cracks were beginning to form. Brenda's personal life was more complex than her public image suggested. People in her community described her as attractive, charismatic, and flirtatious. According to testimony later revealed at her trial, Brenda had engaged in multiple affairs over the years, showing a side of herself that clashed with the pious image she presented to her church and neighbors. Her choice of clothing, tight-fitting dresses, and low-cut tops became the subject of gossip. It wasn't hidden, but in a community like Enid, these details carried weight, shaping opinions about her character. By 2001, Brenda and Rob's marriage had broken down completely. She had filed for divorce just weeks before his death, and emotionally she had already moved on. Brenda began a relationship with James Pavitt, a fellow Sunday school teacher at their church and, notably, Rob's insurance agent. The entanglement added layers of complexity to an already tense family situation, creating financial and emotional stakes that would later become central to the legal case. Women in Brenda's situation rarely face death sentences. Across the United States, female offenders are seldom put to death, especially for crimes like killing a spouse. Oklahoma, since statehood in 1907, had executed only 4 women, and 3 of them died in the same year that Rob Andrew was murdered, 2001. Experts explain this rarity by noting that juries often perceive women as less dangerous than men. But when a woman steps outside the roles society deems appropriate, when she is perceived as an immoral mother, an unfaithful spouse, or sexually promiscuous, the legal system responds differently. It punishes more severely, and in Brenda Andrews' case, that lesson would be enforced brutally. November 20, 2001, began as a routine custody exchange. Rob Andrew, 39, drove to his former family home to collect his children for Thanksgiving weekend. He likely anticipated a quiet visit, perhaps a simple holiday with his kids. What unfolded instead was a scene that would shock the state. 2 shotgun blasts rang through the garage. Rob Andrew was killed instantly, struck twice. Brenda Andrew also sustained a wound, but it was superficial, a graze across her arm that barely broke the skin. When law enforcement arrived, they encountered a scene that would become one of Oklahoma's most controversial and debated murder cases. The murder was far from spontaneous. Warnings had emerged weeks before. Rob had reported to the police that someone had tampered with his car's brake lines. He expressed concern that Brenda and James Pavitt were plotting against him, motivated in part by a life insurance policy that he had recently adjusted. Despite filing the report, no protective measures were taken, leaving Rob vulnerable. The motive seemed clear: a combination of financial gain, custody disputes, and personal betrayal created the conditions for a tragic confrontation. Immediately following the murder, Brenda's actions drew scrutiny. Instead of attending Rob's funeral with her children, she fled with them and Pavitt, traveling to Mexico to evade authorities. They remained on the run for nearly 3 months, avoiding capture while investigators pieced together the evidence. Their return attempt to the U.S. was met with law enforcement at the border, and both Brenda and Pavitt were arrested and brought back to Oklahoma to face charges. Evidence rapidly mounted. Phone records showed communication between Brenda and Pavitt prior to the murder. Witnesses corroborated the existence of an affair and alleged discussions of plans that could implicate Brenda. The strongest evidence, however, came from Pavitt himself. He confessed to pulling the trigger, admitting to shooting Rob Andrew with a shotgun. Yet he claimed that he acted alone, stating that Brenda had no involvement in planning or executing the murder. Law enforcement, however, remained skeptical of this assertion. From the moment officers examined the scene, inconsistencies in Brenda's account raised suspicion. She portrayed herself as a fellow victim, sustaining injury in the same attack, but forensic evidence suggested otherwise. The superficial nature of her wound contrasted sharply with Rob's fatal injuries. Investigators noted this discrepancy, questioning Brenda's story as details continued to shift. Her responses seemed more self-interested than concerned with the death of her children's father, which deepened doubts about her credibility. Investigators delved further into Brenda's personal history. They discovered patterns in her relationships, documenting frequent interactions with Pavitt leading up to the murder. Witnesses described her alleged sexual behavior, framing her as manipulative. Financial motives were emphasized, particularly concerning life insurance policies that Brenda would benefit from. These factors collectively suggested the possibility of a premeditated murder-for-hire scenario, orchestrated by Brenda, though direct evidence remained elusive. When questioned, Pavitt confessed to the shootings but insisted he acted independently. Police, unwilling to accept his claim at face value, pursued the theory that Brenda orchestrated the murder. The prosecution charged both Brenda and Pavitt with first-degree murder and conspiracy, though proving Brenda's role presented a substantial challenge. Circumstantial evidence dominated, as there were no eyewitnesses linking her to the shooting, no fingerprints on the weapon, and no admissions of guilt. Faced with this predicament, prosecutors shifted strategy. Unable to prove Brenda's direct involvement, they sought to portray her character in a manner that would bias the jury. They presented extensive evidence about her personal life, emphasizing her sexual behavior, her relationships with other men, and her alleged moral failings. Clothing choices, affairs, and even books in her possession became material to the case, not for relevance to the crime, but to paint Brenda as a woman whose moral character justified the death penalty. The trial was marked by dramatic, sensational moments. During closing arguments, prosecutors displayed Brenda's underwear, questioning whether a grieving widow would pack such items to elude authorities with her lover. The courtroom reacted with shock. Newspaper reports detailed the gasps and murmurs from spectators. Legal experts noted the highly prejudicial nature of these tactics, framing Brenda's sexuality as central to the case rather than the murder itself. Throughout the trial, emotionally charged language targeted Brenda. She was labeled with derogatory terms, her behavior framed as manipulative and dangerous. Defense attorneys countered, arguing the lack of substantive evidence and highlighting Pavitt's confession. They emphasized that the state relied on character assassination, not facts, and contended that Brenda was being punished for her lifestyle choices rather than criminal actions. Despite the defense, the jury was swayed. Weeks of testimony about her alleged promiscuity, her appearance, and her behavior created an image of a morally corrupt woman, and not simply a defendant facing criminal charges. Brenda Andrew was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The jury recommended the death penalty, and the judges largely upheld the conviction despite acknowledging concerns about the relevance of much of the sexual evidence. Judge Arlene Johnson, the sole female judge on the Oklahoma Appeals Court at the time, partially dissented. She expressed difficulty asserting that the death sentence was imposed without influence from improper evidence and arguments. Years later, Judge Robert Bacharach, reviewing the case on appeal, went further, noting that the trial fixated on Brenda's sexuality in a way that obscured any realistic consideration of her actual involvement in the crime. As the case moved through appeals, Brenda's legal team argued that the trial was fundamentally unfair. They maintained that prosecutors weaponized gender stereotypes, using her sexual history to manipulate the jury. Evidence regarding her personal life, clothing, and alleged affairs were irrelevant to the murder charge but central to the narrative presented to the jury. Appeals courts initially upheld the conviction, citing harmless error, but dissenting opinions highlighted the systemic prejudices at play. Then, Brenda's lawyers brought the case to the Supreme Court. On January 21, 2025, the court ruled 7-2 in her favor, instructing lower courts to reassess the trial's fairness. The decision opened the door for further appeals and potential retrial, raising questions about whether prejudice, rather than evidence, influenced the original verdict. Brenda Andrew remained on death row, isolated for over 2 decades, as the legal battle continued to unfold. Brenda Andrew still awaiting the outcome of her appeals, living in near-complete isolation at the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center in Oklahoma. She remains the only woman on Oklahoma's death row, a fact that underscores the rarity of female executions in the state and across the United States. Her daily life is marked by monotony and uncertainty. Brenda spends her time confined to a small cell, separated from the general prison population. Days are filled with legal paperwork, correspondence with attorneys, and the constant awareness that the state intends to carry out her execution. Yet beyond the walls of her cell, Brenda's case has captured national attention, raising profound questions about gender, justice, and the influence of stereotypes in the legal system. Oklahoma has executed few women throughout its history. Since 1903, when the region was still Indian Territory, only 4 women had been put to death by the state. The first was Dora Wright, a black woman hanged for killing a child. Nearly a century later, in 2001, 3 women were executed in the same year Rob Andrew was murdered: Wanda Jean Allen, Marilyn K. Plants, and Lois Nadine Smith. Brenda Andrews' case stood out because, unlike these prior executions, it was not based purely on evidence of the crime, but appeared heavily influenced by her perceived morality and sexuality. Legal experts noted that the state's prosecution relied extensively on prejudicial information that painted Brenda as a woman who had violated societal norms. Advocacy groups and legal organizations quickly took notice. They argued that Brenda's conviction was shaped by sexism rather than concrete evidence. These groups pointed out that her sex life, clothing choices, and personal relationships were presented to the jury as indicators of criminality, rather than relevant facts tied to the murder. Experts describe this approach as sex shaming, a tactic that has appeared in other criminal trials involving women but rarely results in a death sentence. Brenda's attorneys cited prior rulings in which courts had rejected racial stereotypes used to justify capital punishment, arguing that gender-based stereotypes should be treated with the same scrutiny. Throughout her appeals, Brenda maintained her innocence. She consistently argued that James Pavitt acted alone and that there was no proof she had orchestrated or carried out the murder. The central issue in her appeal became whether the trial was fundamentally unfair due to the heavy emphasis on her sexual behavior. Her legal team presented 10 separate arguments, each highlighting how evidence about her affairs, clothing, and alleged sexual advances had no bearing on whether she committed murder but had a profound impact on the jury's perception of her. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals initially upheld her conviction in 2007, acknowledging that much of the sexual evidence seemed irrelevant, but claiming it was harmless in the context of the overall trial. Judge Arlene Johnson's dissent highlighted the dangerous precedent of allowing such evidence to influence a jury, even subtly. The federal appeals court later upheld the conviction in 2023, despite a dissenting judge, Robert Bacharach, who emphasized that the state's focus on Brenda's sexuality presented her as a modern Jezebel, and that this portrayal had denied her a fair opportunity to present her side of the story. The Supreme Court's decision in January 2025 marked a critical turning point. The 7-2 ruling did not overturn Brenda's conviction outright, but ordered the lower courts to reevaluate the trial's fairness. This decision highlighted the role of prejudicial evidence and emphasized that a jury's perception should not be manipulated through gendered stereotypes. Only Justices Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch dissented, arguing that some of the evidence about Brenda's sexual behavior was relevant to understanding her character in relation to the alleged conspiracy. The majority, however, sided with the principle that personal morality should not substitute for factual proof in a capital case. Even as the legal process unfolded, Brenda's life on death row remained stark and isolating. She had little contact with the outside world, and the emotional toll of decades of confinement weighed heavily. Yet she found solace in small routines: reading, corresponding with her legal team, and occasional visits from supporters who believed in her innocence. The psychological strain of being the only woman on death row, facing execution in a system that rarely condemns women to death, created a unique and intense form of pressure. Brenda's situation underscored the human cost of a legal system that allows prejudice to influence life and death decisions. The broader implications of her case drew attention from legal scholars, gender rights advocates, and the media. Brenda's situation became emblematic of how women can be judged differently from men in the criminal justice system. When a woman is perceived as a bad mother, an unfaithful spouse, or sexually deviant, juries are more likely to impose severe punishments. Statistical studies show that female offenders rarely receive the death penalty, but when they do, gender norms often play a crucial role in the decision. Brenda Andrew's trial became a focal point for examining these disparities, sparking conversations about fairness, gender bias, and systemic inequalities in capital cases. Brenda's legal team leveraged these arguments in federal appeals, asserting that her trial violated the 14th Amendment's due process protections. They argued that the state's reliance on gendered stereotypes created a fundamentally unfair environment, undermining the jury's ability to judge the evidence objectively. The emphasis on her sexual history was not incidental. It was central to the prosecution's strategy. In essence, Brenda was being punished for being a woman who did not conform to societal expectations, rather than for committing a criminal act. The Supreme Court ruling offered hope but did not guarantee a new trial. It mandated that lower courts carefully consider whether the prejudicial nature of the sexual evidence had unfairly influenced the outcome. This directive placed significant responsibility on judges to evaluate the impact of societal bias and ensure that the jury's verdict reflected evidence rather than gendered assumptions. For Brenda, it was a lifeline, a chance for the legal system to acknowledge that prejudice may have overshadowed justice. Throughout her ordeal, Brenda's story has illuminated systemic problems in the treatment of female defendants. Experts note that when women deviate from socially acceptable roles, particularly as wives or mothers, the consequences can be disproportionately severe. In Brenda's case, prosecutors used her sex life as a weapon, presenting her as morally corrupt and manipulative. The jury's exposure to this narrative may have been decisive, shifting focus from the facts of the murder to judgments about her character. The case also highlighted the intersection of gender and capital punishment. While men convicted of similar crimes often face trials centered on evidence, women may encounter proceedings where personal morality and societal expectations are scrutinized in detail. Brenda Andrews' trial exemplified this disparity. Legal scholars argue that such practices undermine the integrity of the judicial system and raise critical questions about equality. Before the LAW, the lower courts prepare to reevaluate Brenda's trial. Her legal team continues to press for a full review of the prejudicial evidence. They argue that a fair trial must consider whether character attacks and sexualized portrayals influence the jury's decision more than facts and direct evidence. The stakes are immense. The difference between a death sentence and a chance at justice between life and death. Brenda Andrew's case now serves as a lens through which broader questions about fairness, bias, and gender in the legal system are examined. For over 20 years, Brenda Andrew has lived with uncertainty, isolated in her cell, her life hanging in the balance. Her case has drawn attention to a rarely discussed but crucial issue: the role of gender bias in the application of the death penalty. It forces society to ask difficult questions. Should a woman's sexuality influence the jury's perception of guilt? Can moral judgment replace factual evidence in determining a defendant's fate? Brenda's legal journey has sparked discussions at the highest levels, from state courts to the Supreme Court, and it continues to challenge assumptions about justice and fairness. Advocates hope that the renewed examination of her trial will result in a fairer assessment of the evidence. The Supreme Court's intervention has set a precedent for scrutinizing cases in which personal morality is weaponized against defendants. Brenda Andrew's fight is no longer solely about her life. It is about the integrity of the judicial process and the broader implications for women facing the most severe punishment under the law. Her case has attracted nationwide attention, with legal commentators, journalists, and civil rights organizations analyzing each development. Scholars highlight the parallels between racial bias in capital cases and gender bias, noting that stereotypes, whether based on race or sex, can influence outcomes in profound ways. Brenda's legal team has pointed to prior rulings in which courts found racial prejudice unconstitutional in capital cases, asserting that gender-based prejudice should be treated with equal seriousness. As the case returns to the lower courts, the nation watches closely. Brenda Andrew's story is not merely one of a single woman facing execution. It is a story about systemic inequality, about how societal expectations and prejudices can infiltrate the courtroom, shaping verdicts and determining fates. Her trial, appeals, and the Supreme Court's intervention collectively reveal the fragility of fairness when bias is allowed to dictate outcomes. For Brenda Andrew, life on death row continues. Each day is marked by the same uncertainty, the same confinement, and the same hope that justice may finally prevail. Her story is a stark reminder that in the criminal justice system, the human element, bias, perception, and societal expectation, can be just as powerful as evidence. Brenda's fight for a fair trial continues, and it resonates far beyond her cell, influencing debates about law, gender, and equality across the United States. Her case forces a reevaluation of legal principles that are often taken for granted. It challenges judges, lawyers, and the public to consider whether character assassination and gendered stereotypes should ever play a role in determining life or death. Brenda Andrew's story is a call to examine the ways in which prejudice can distort justice and to recognize the unique challenges women face when navigating a system built largely around male norms and expectations. As Brenda waits for the lower courts to follow the Supreme Court's guidance, the implications of her case ripple outward. Scholars continue to analyze the influence of gender bias in capital punishment. Legal reforms are debated. Advocacy groups rally for awareness. And through it all, Brenda Andrew remains at the center of a legal and cultural conversation about fairness, justice, and the treatment of women under the law. Her case is more than a story of one woman on death row. It is a lens into a judicial system grappling with its own biases. It is about how society views women who step outside prescribed norms. It is about ensuring that trials are decided based on evidence and law, not societal judgments or prejudicial assumptions. Brenda Andrew's fight continues, and her life, like the case itself, has become emblematic of broader struggles for fairness and equality in the American legal system. Brenda Andrew's case exposes a troubling reality about the American legal system. When women face serious charges, their identity as women often overshadows the actual facts of the case. The question becomes less about what she did, and more about what kind of woman she is. And sometimes, being labeled the wrong kind of woman is enough to put someone on death row. After more than 2 decades behind bars, the Supreme Court's 2025 ruling has given Brenda a chance many thought she would never have: the opportunity to argue that her trial was fundamentally unfair. Whether she is guilty or innocent, one truth is undeniable. Her trial was heavily influenced by prejudice. Prosecutors weaponized her sexuality, her clothing choices, and her perceived failures as a wife and mother to convince the jury she deserved the death penalty. The focus was on her as a woman, not on the actual evidence of the crime she was accused of committing. The Supreme Court's decision shines a light on critical questions about justice. Can a trial be considered fair if it relies on stereotypes instead of facts? Should a woman's private life determine whether she lives or dies? How many other women have faced convictions not because of the evidence, but because they did not conform to society's expectations? As Brenda Andrew's case goes back to the lower courts, the nation watches closely. Will she be granted a new trial? Could her conviction be overturned? Or will Oklahoma still carry out her execution? If Brenda's story made you reflect on fairness, justice, and gender bias in the legal system, please like this video and share it with others. Subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories that challenge how we view justice in America.